Drop your weapons or die where you stand." The order thundered across the valley. Red laser dots from the circling drone crawled over the SEAL's armor one by one. Outnumbered, trapped with no escape, even America's finest lowered their rifles into the dust. The kill zone had swallowed whole squads before, and now it was ready to claim another. But then, against all logic, a lone figure stepped out from the ridge. No orders, no backup, no permission, just an observer, until she walked straight into the fire. Every step she took was a challenge thrown in death's face. So who was she really? Just a clerk misplaced in a war zone, or a hidden weapon the battlefield never saw coming? This is VeteranBiker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The first sound wasn't gunfire. It was the sharp electronic whine of a drone engine cutting across the hollow basin like a saw blade through silence. Echo Squad, huddled among jagged stone outcroppings in the rift, froze in place as the shadow of the aircraft crept across them. A red dot appeared on the chest plate of one operator. Then it shifted, crawling like a predator's eye to the next man, and the next. Each glowing mark lingered a second too long, a promise written in light. The desert wind carried the smell of burnt metal and old dust, whipping sand into eyes already bloodshot from hours without rest. But no one blinked, no one dared. They all knew what it meant to be painted like that. Somewhere above, someone was watching through the drone's lens, deciding who would be the first to vanish in a spray of shattered Kevlar and blood. A murmur cracked over the radio, broken by static. A young SEAL whispered something not meant for anyone but himself. Half a farewell, half a prayer, and then the channel went dead again, suffocated by interference. His team leader, Ethan Draven, glanced around at the men under his charge. Shoulders sagged, rifles hung low, and the lines on their faces told a story of resignation. The fight had drained out of them, stolen not by bullets but by inevitability. The rift had done this before. It had devoured men better armed, better rested, and equally determined. 3 squads had walked down those slopes. Only fragments of them had come back. And now Echo found themselves in the same trap, eyes locked on a sky where death hummed in circles. Up on the ridge, far above the killing ground, a lone figure watched through field glasses. Kane stood motionless, one hand steady on her notes, the other tightening around the cold steel frame of the binoculars. Her uniform carried no visible insignia of command, just the dull colors of someone meant to sit in the background and observe. To the men down below, she was supposed to be a statistician, a recorder of events. Someone who would catalogue the tragedy after it happened, not prevent it. But the way she didn't flinch when the drone dipped lower, the way her posture didn't betray even a flicker of fear, those details told another story, one that nobody else yet understood. She lowered the lenses and pressed the edge of her clipboard against her thigh. For a long moment she simply stood in the scorching wind, watching as the team she had been assigned to assess sagged into something dangerously close to surrender. From the ground, Ethan Draven raised his head, squinting up through the sun glare toward the ridge. Through the shimmer of heat, he could just make out her silhouette, unmoving like a statue carved out of defiance. His gut twisted with something he couldn't quite name. Irritation, maybe, or suspicion. Cruz Vega, crouched beside him, muttered under his breath, "They've marked us, Chief! Whoever's flying that thing is playing with us before they pull the trigger." Draven's jaw clenched. He'd been in enough fights to know when the field had shifted past tactics and into survival mathematics. Right now, The numbers didn't add up. And then, as if to confirm their worst fears, the red dot returned, this time dancing across Draven's own chest plate. The drone whirred above them like a mechanical vulture. He felt the weight of inevitability settle on his shoulders. Behind him, Oren Hale pressed his back against a slab of rock, eyes closed, whispering a goodbye message he hadn't expected to say out loud. Noah Idris tapped at a useless radio, the static mocking him with its emptiness. Every man there carried years of training, scars of battles, medals tucked away in drawers back home. Yet at this moment, all of it meant nothing. The rift had stolen their choices, but up on that ridge, Anna Kane hadn't moved. The clipboard hung at her side, forgotten, her gaze locked on the geometry of the basin below. She wasn't counting casualties. She was measuring angles, calculating shadows, reading the terrain like it was a page she'd memorized long ago. The drone banked, sunlight flashing off its metallic wings, and the hum shifted pitch. Draven exhaled slowly, almost ready to give the order no commander ever wants to give. Lower your weapons, accept the terms, survive if they let you. One by one, rifles dipped toward the ground, not flung aside, not abandoned, just lowered, the way men do when they realize defiance will only get their brothers killed faster. The rift was silent except for the drone's taunting buzz. And then, against that silence, something subtle changed. A figure detached from the skyline above. From the vantage point of the basin, it looked almost impossible. One woman stepping forward, into the glare of the sun, down the rocky slope where no sane observer should tread. The operators in the valley froze, confusion briefly replacing despair. Draven followed their eyes upward and saw her. Clipboard gone, posture transformed, boots grinding into the stone as if she had every right to enter the same arena that had swallowed so many before. Anna Kane, the logistics officer, the note-taker, the outsider. She was walking into the kill zone. The drone shifted, its red dot sliding away from Draven's armor, climbing up the slope to meet the new intruder. The men watched in disbelief as the beam found her chest and hovered there. But she didn't stop. The rift, for the first time in months, seemed to hesitate. The men in the basin could hardly process what they were seeing. A woman in standard fatigues, without visible insignia of rank or combat gear, had stepped forward into the same ground that had broken seasoned operators. For a second they thought it was madness, an unarmed observer wandering into a killing field. But to Anna Kane, madness was something else entirely. She had watched units crumble when they believed themselves cornered. She had studied the topography of the rift from the first moment she'd set foot at Fob Redhaven. And the picture she saw was not despair, it was a problem waiting to be solved. Hours earlier, when the helicopter blades whipped dust into the airstrip, no one watching her arrival had guessed she might walk into battle at all. She had moved with the ease of someone accustomed to harsh terrain, yet she carried nothing more threatening than a clipboard. Dust settled into her hair, caught in the creases of her uniform, but she didn't shield her face the way others did. She endured the sting of grit with a stillness that unnerved some of the younger soldiers. Ethan Draven had seen her then, stepping out of the rotor wash like a civilian misplaced in a war zone. She didn't carry herself like someone requesting protection. She walked as though she were the one granting it. He had muttered under his breath that babysitting logistics was not part of the mission. Cruz Vega, always quick to voice irritation, had agreed. To them, Kane represented another bureaucratic burden, a box to be checked for headquarters. The tactical briefing later that morning had only deepened their confusion. Maps of the rift stretched across the walls, red markers forming constellations of death where squads had disappeared. Voices were subdued, as though even naming the losses risked summoning them back. When it came time for questions, Draven expected her to inquire about supply lines or reporting formats. Instead, she raised her gaze, calm and deliberate, and asked, "What direction do the currents move inside that depression?" The room had gone still. Operators shifted uncomfortably. Noah Idris pulled up data he rarely bothered to reference. Weather overlays showing thermals rising with the sun, downdrafts sliding into shadow at dusk. He explained it quickly, almost apologetically. Kane only nodded, writing something with precise strokes. The way her pen moved was unnerving. She wasn't recording, she was confirming. Draven had felt a prickle of unease then, though he covered it with irritation. What kind of desk officer thought about airflow while others remembered where brothers had bled out? Later, as they geared up, that unease sharpened. Echo Squad performed the ritual they all knew too well. Letters folded in pockets, recordings, stored on locked devices, instructions for families who might never hear their voices again. Routine, grim, but necessary. Draven noticed Kane again at the edge of the motor pool. She was no longer clutching just paper. A compact rucksack hung over her shoulder. From its side pocket he glimpsed something not issued to observers, sterile. Bandages rolled with practiced care, combat gloves worn soft by use. Nothing dramatic, but enough to mark her as someone who thought ahead about survival, not just of others but her own. Word spread quickly in the claustrophobic world of the base. A junior officer, curious or careless, had streamed a snippet of Echo's final preparations over the internal network. The footage was brief. Men loading gear, engines rumbling, and at the edge of the frame, a woman tightening her boots with slow certainty. That clip rippled through the base before anyone could stop it. In the chow hall, whispers began. Who is she? Why is she going? By the time the convoy rolled out past the wire, Kane was no longer just an administrative ghost. She was a rumor, a question none of them wanted to answer out loud. The rift loomed ahead after hours of punishing terrain. The land didn't welcome them, it funneled them. Sharp ridges closed in, sun baking the stone until it radiated heat like a furnace. As they halted on the overlook, Draven gave the usual orders: vehicles in defensive, circle, communications at tight intervals, overwatch to remain on high ground. Kane had accepted the assignment without a word. She climbed to a rocky perch that offered clear sightlines into the basin. From there, her binoculars swept the valley with methodical precision. She didn't fidget. She didn't wipe sweat. She simply studied as though the ground were a book only she could read. That was before the channels went silent. Before the drone sang its predatory note. Before the red dots danced across body armor. Now, watching her descend into the valley, Draven's mind reeled. This wasn't the Kane who had scribbled on a clipboard during the briefing. This wasn't the quiet woman who'd stood still in the dust of the landing zone. This was someone else. Someone who had waited until the last possible second to show herself. Vega spat into the dirt, voice hoarse. "Chief, what is she doing?" Draven didn't answer. He couldn't. His men had already lowered their rifles, convinced resistance was suicide. Yet here she was, breaking the script everyone else had been forced to follow. The drone tracked her relentlessly, its sensor locked onto her chest, holding steady as if daring her to flinch. She didn't. Her stride never faltered, each step precise, deliberate, carrying her deeper into a hollow that had erased entire units. From his position, Oren Hale felt his throat tighten. He whispered almost to himself, "She's walking where even ghosts don't linger." The men didn't understand it yet. To them, Kane was still an anomaly an error in deployment paperwork. But the rift had just gained a new player, one who didn't accept the boundaries that had trapped them, and as the sun slid higher, throwing harsh light across unforgiving stone, every soldier in that basin realized something they hadn't expected to feel again, the faint, disorienting spark of possibility. Because one woman had chosen to walk forward when everyone else had already stopped. The first radio check passed without concern, voices clipped, professional routine, checkpoint secured, continuing movement, nothing unusual in the cadence, nothing to suggest the rift was already tightening its grip. Anna Kane acknowledged from her perch on the ridge, her reply measured and calm. She kept her tone as neutral as weather reporting, careful not to transmit the unease that coiled beneath her ribs. 15 minutes later, another call. Faint distortion flickered across the signal, like a breath caught in static. Still, the message came through. Location updated, progress noted. Kane adjusted the angle of her binoculars, tracing their descent. Through the glass she saw shapes weaving carefully between outcrops, shadows elongating under the punishing light. At the half-hour mark, the rhythm cracked. The headset hissed, fragments of syllables bleeding through before vanishing into white noise. Kane tried each preset in turn, primary, backup, emergency. Nothing held. Her fingers moved with practiced economy, not frantic but relentless, scanning every frequency she'd ever memorized. Silence met her each time. Down below, the squad's formation faltered. She could see it in the way helmets turned, in the slight hesitation at each bend of terrain. They were speaking, but the mountains swallowed their voices, leaving only the oppressive hum of the drone overhead. Kane set the headset aside and leaned into the scope again. The valley offered nothing at first glance, just unforgiving stone, twisted gullies, the suggestion of movement where heat shimmered. Yet, as she narrowed her focus, patterns emerged, lines that didn't belong. Shadows too sharp to be natural, dark silhouettes pressed flush against rock, camouflaged yet betrayed by stillness. Her jaw tightened. The rift was crawling with watchers, unseen by the men caught in its throat. Below, Ethan Draven halted in the open. From this distance his posture said everything, weapon drooping at his side, shoulders squared against inevitability. His men followed suit, rifles angled down, stances slackened by the weight of defeat. To Kane, the scene resembled not surrender but resignation, as if the valley itself had convinced them resistance was pointless. For a moment she remained utterly still, the desert wind tugging at her hair, grit collecting at the corner of her mouth. Then she lowered the binoculars and unshouldered the rucksack that had drawn whispers earlier that day. Inside lay no papers, no spreadsheets. Instead, compact tools of a different trade. A suppressed rifle broken down into neat components, a sidearm scarred from years of handling, a harness webbed with pouches, each filled with instruments of survival. Ammunition, medical kits, grenades with pins taped for speed. Her hands moved without hesitation, reassembling steel with the ease of long memory. Each motion clicked into place with the confidence of someone who had done this in the dark, under fire, half-conscious from blood loss. This was not improvisation. This was muscle memory carved deep. She strapped the harness across her torso, the weight settling like an old friend. Clipped the sidearm to her thigh, slid magazines into place. Not once did her breathing quicken. If anything, the stillness in her face deepened. The last piece was a small strip of cloth folded into a pack, black fabric worn smooth at the edges. She pressed it between her fingers for a second, then tucked it back where it came from. No ceremony, no explanation, just acknowledgement. She glanced once more through the binoculars. The drone circled leisurely, red beam drifting across helmets, bowed in reluctant obedience, her lips pressed into a thin line. Kane rose. She didn't descend into the basin where her team awaited fate. Instead, she turned her back to the obvious path and began climbing the opposite ridge. Terrain that looked nearly vertical, riddled with loose shale, the kind of ground that punished missteps with broken bones. The climb demanded patience. Each foothold threatened to crumble, each ledge sloped treacherously toward empty air. She moved carefully, not slowly. Her boots found purchase where none seemed possible, her body folding into shadows, melding with stone as though the mountain had always meant to conceal her. Far below, Draven's radio crackled weakly once more. Echo, contact, can't identify, then only static. He cursed under his breath, but his eyes drifted upward in time to glimpse a silhouette sliding out of sight against the ridgeline. He realized who it was a heartbeat later. His pulse spiked with something he didn't want to name. Relief. For the operators, time dulled. Seconds bled into long minutes as they remained frozen in that hollow, marked by the drone, hemmed in by phantoms they couldn't see. But high above, Kane was rewriting the geometry of the rift. She remembered the weather patterns she had inquired about that morning. Updrafts carrying dust, crosswinds creating micro-eddies. They were more than atmospheric trivia. They dictated how sound traveled, how the enemy positioned their rifles, how smoke would drift if gunfire erupted. She had memorized the rhythm of the air itself. The first enemy position revealed itself just ahead, a shallow scrape of earth behind boulders, perfect for an overwatch angle. Through the crack of stone she glimpsed the curve of a barrel, the gloved hand of a sniper adjusting his scope. He was fixated entirely on the basin below, blind to the ghost climbing above him. Kane steadied her rifle, exhaled, and pressed the trigger once. The weapon barely whispered. The figure slumped, sliding silently onto the sand. She didn't linger to watch him fall. She advanced, weaving between jagged walls, each step chosen for silence. Further along the ridge, voices murmured within a natural cavity, casual, unhurried. Men discussing their quarry as though the outcome were already guaranteed. Kane eased a grenade from her harness, thumb rolling the pin loose. She counted under her breath, then flicked the sphere into darkness and dropped flat. The detonation ripped through the cavity, a thunderclap bouncing across the rift. Dust and shards sprayed outward, the echo masking her retreat as she slid back into cover. Down below, Echo Squad jerked their heads upward. For the first time that day, the battlefield sounded different. Not just oppressive silence, but the unmistakable violence of someone dismantling the trap from within. Draven's eyes narrowed. Whoever was doing it wasn't one of his men. He clenched the grip of his rifle, realization dawning. Kane, he barked into his dead radio anyway. "Overwatch! Report!" The channel spat static, then, against all odds, a voice threaded through. Calm, steady, unfazed. Continue movement. Opposition is being reduced. Vega's jaw dropped. That's her. Another blast rumbled across the ridge, sending a tremor through stone. Dust drifted into the valley like ash. For Echo Squad, resignation gave way to disbelief. Could one person shift the balance that had buried so many before them? Kane didn't ask for their faith. She asked only for time. And with each target she erased, with each stronghold she collapsed, the rift lost a fragment of its dominion. She pressed forward, deeper into terrain designed to kill, rewriting the rules one deliberate step at a time. And for the first time since they had entered that cursed hollow, the men below felt the weight on their shoulders lift, not gone, not yet, but lighter. enough to remind them they were still alive, because someone they had dismissed as a bystander was proving herself to be the one piece the rift hadn't accounted for. The blast that rolled across the rift changed everything. Echo Squad, hunched in the hollow, lifted their heads as debris scattered down the slopes. For weeks, the valley had been defined by silence, broken only by the drone's sinister buzz. Now thunder answered back, shaking the mountain itself. Ethan Draven pressed his cheek to the dirt, scanning the ridgeline through narrowed eyes. Smoke curled out of a fissure, fading quickly in the dry air. Whoever had triggered that explosion hadn't done it by accident. Cruz Vega swore softly. Somebody's up there cutting through their nests. Draven didn't reply. He didn't need to. The men could feel it, the invisible chokehold loosening. Up above, Anna Kane moved like a shadow among stone. The wound in her shoulder, a fresh line carved by a sniper round that had glanced past, bled steadily down her sleeve, but she ignored the sting. Pain was a distraction she'd long since learned to mute. Her rifle stayed snug against her shoulder, eyes locked on the terrain ahead. The ridge unfolded into a maze of gullies and narrow ledges, each bend concealing another potential killer. She advanced with absolute intent, scanning angles the enemy believed safe. Years of practice taught her to spot the small betrayals, a scrape too smooth on, rock where boots had shifted, a sliver of reflection where glass met sunlight. The second stronghold she targeted was more elaborate, a dugout carved beneath. An overhanging slab, camouflaged with brush, dragged up from the valley floor. From the basin below, it would appear like nothing more than a scar in the earth. From her vantage, she saw the flicker of movement, a figure adjusting his firing position. Kane dropped low, belly against the dirt, and inched forward. The scent of cordite drifted faintly on the wind, evidence of rifles fired hours earlier. When the shooter shifted weight to one knee, she squeezed off 2 quick shots. The suppressed cracks barely echoed, but the man collapsed, limbs jerking, weapon clattering against stone. A second insurgent scrambled inside the dugout, yanking his rifle toward the entrance. Kane rolled sideways, firing again. His body slammed against the interior wall. Dust plumed outward, and then stillness. From the basin, Noah Idris raised his binoculars. He caught the distant shimmer of movement above them, a tiny silhouette repositioning, smoke trailing faintly in the air. His stomach lurched when realization struck. "That's her," he muttered. Orrin Hale gave a strained laugh. "She's not observing. She's cleaning house." The words rippled through the squad, disbelief mingling with a spark they hadn't felt since. Entering the rift, the sense that maybe, just maybe, this valley could be taken back. Kane pressed on. She skirted along the ridge until the ground opened into a precarious ledge no wider than her boots. Below, Echo Squad crouched in the dust, the drone still hovering but its dominance unraveling with every strike she made. She kept to the shadows, letting the contours of the mountains swallow her figure. The third position proved trickier. A natural chimney jutted upward, its opening concealed by stacked rock. Through the narrow slit she glimpsed the glint of optics. Whoever occupied it had near-perfect oversight of the valley floor, able to pivot and track movement across a 360-degree arc. It was a fortress in miniature. To approach meant crossing open ground. No cover, no shelter, just bare rock exposed to every eye. Kane's pulse remained steady as she gauged the distance. She inhaled, then sprinted low, boots hammering against stone. The sniper within the chimney twisted, trying to adjust his barrel. Too slow. Kane's shot stitched across his chest before he could pull the trigger. His weapon tumbled out, clattering down the slope. From below, Draven saw the rifle fall. His heart hammered as the realization set in. One of the deadliest Overwatch positions had just gone silent. He turned to his men, voice rising. "Get ready to move. We're not done yet." For the first time in hours, their grips tightened on weapons, not as burdens, but as tools again. Shoulders straightened. Breath came sharper. They had been moments from laying down arms. Now, against all logic, they were preparing to fight. Another eruption thundered from the opposite side of the ridge. Kane's work again. Dust rolled across the valley like smoke from a dying fire. The drone's sensor beam flickered uncertainly, as though whoever controlled it had lost their grip on the situation. Cruz Vega clenched his teeth. "Who the hell is she, Chief? Logistics doesn't move like that." Draven didn't answer. His focus was fixed on the ridgeline, where a lone figure dismantled the enemy with ruthless efficiency. "Whoever she is," he muttered, "she just bought us another chance." Kane reloaded smoothly, sliding a fresh magazine into place, the motion so ingrained it seemed mechanical. Her hands were stained now. Dust, sweat, her own blood, but her eyes burned with clarity. She remembered missions buried under layers of classification, operations that never appeared in briefings or official records. The rift was just another battlefield carved out of geography, and geography could be rewritten with enough precision. She moved toward the next threat, a crew-served weapon hidden in a fissure. From inside, 3 men coordinated their fields of fire, oblivious to her approach from above. She lowered herself onto her stomach, crept along a natural shelf, and lobbed a grenade into the opening. The blast shook the ground, fire licking out of the crack. She rolled away, debris peppering her armor. Echo Squad flinched at the sound, then exchanged glances that brimmed with cautious hope. Draven keyed his useless radio again out of reflex. To his shock, the channel snapped alive. Her voice calm as if reporting weather data, grid sector clear. "Advance to next point." The squad stared at one another. Relief, disbelief, something between awe and fear. "Copy," Draven answered, throat tight. Echo on the move. They rose from the dirt, weapons raised, and began edging forward through the valley. It wasn't liberation yet, but it was no longer surrender. Above, Kane felt the shift ripple through the men. She didn't need to see their faces to know. She had given them oxygen again. Breathing room in a place designed to suffocate. Yet the job wasn't done. Further along the ridge, another fortified pocket awaited. She scaled upward, blood from her shoulder soaking deeper into fabric, every movement deliberate. At the crest, she paused, surveying the valley below. The rift sprawled beneath her like a scar carved into the earth, its silence shattered now by the echoes of her defiance. She whispered to herself, too low for anyone else to hear, "Not observers, never were." Then she rose and stepped toward the next battle hidden in stone. And in that moment, the rift, once a graveyard, felt suddenly, impossibly, like contested ground again. Echo Squad advanced cautiously, every step an act of defiance. The valley that had felt like a tomb now vibrated with the echoes of detonations along the cliffs. Dust clouds lingered in the air, drifting like smoke after a long fire, and the oppressive certainty of defeat had thinned into something almost unfamiliar, momentum. Ethan Draven led from the front, boots pressing into soil that still carried the scent of explosives. His men fanned out behind him, weapons raised again not as props for show, but as tools sharpened by new resolve. The radio crackled intermittently, each fragment of Kane's voice carried through like a lifeline stretched taut across impossible ground. "Advance sector, clear ahead, stay tight." Her calm tone belied the violence she left in her wake. Above them, Kane pressed deeper into hostile positions. The path she took was brutal. jagged edges that sliced palms, loose gravel that slid. Beneath boots, angles so steep that even trained climbers would have hesitated. Yet she moved with the efficiency of someone who trusted not in luck, but in repetition. She had survived terrain like this before, though the files documenting it would never be declassified. At the crest of one rise, she paused and studied the contours below. From here, the basin resembled a broken amphitheater, its floor crowded with stone pillars that gave the illusion of cover while offering no protection against the eyes watching from above. She counted at least 2 more fortified pockets. Fighters crouched behind cleverly concealed slots, rifles fixed on the hollow. The next assault required precision. Kane crouched low, stripped a fragmentation grenade from her harness, and rolled it down into the fissure below. The blast thundered outward, sending shards into the sky. She dropped immediately into cover, shielding her face as the ground trembled. When the ringing in her ears dulled, she moved again. Echo Squad flinched at the eruption but quickly realized its purpose. Cruz Vega let out a strained chuckle, more disbelief than amusement. She's carving them out one by one. Draven's grip tightened on his rifle. He had seen skilled operators before, but this was different. This wasn't a coordinated squad working with overlapping fields of fire. This was a single individual dismantling an entire network designed to trap dozens, and she was doing it faster than anyone had a right to. Another report came through the headset. Grid secure, push forward. Draven nodded, signaling with a raised fist. The men pressed on, weaving between boulders that still shuddered from recent detonations. Each of them carried the same unspoken thought. Whoever Kane truly was, she had altered the rules of engagement completely. High on the ridge, her world had narrowed to breath, trigger, recoil, repeat. She struck targets with relentless accuracy, her focus absolute. She had long ago stopped thinking of herself as an observer. Now she was executioner, tactician, and shield rolled into one. The further she advanced, the more the enemy faltered. Fighters who once held every advantage now scrambled, unnerved by the unseen predator in their ranks. Some abandoned their rifles in panic, slipping down the far slope. Others fired wildly into stone, hoping to scare her back. None succeeded. Below, Echo Squad reached the coordinates they had dreaded, the last known location of their missing comrades. The air here was thick with the metallic tang of blood, even before they found the source. Draven's boot struck something soft at the base of a narrow cleft. He crouched and swept debris aside. Beneath, a hand emerged, fingers trembling faintly. "Silver!" he breathed. They pulled him free from a shallow recess, his body torn with injuries that told of beatings and starvation. His eyes fluttered open at the sound of familiar voices, disbelief washing over him. Takeda lay only a few feet deeper, barely conscious, chest rising shallowly. Both had been hidden deliberately, kept alive not by mercy but strategy, bait to lure in rescue parties that would meet the same fate. Oren Hale dropped beside them, medical kit already in hand. He worked quickly, pressing bandages to wounds, injecting stabilizers, whispering reassurances they might never hear. "Stay with us," Hale muttered, voice cracking despite his training. Draven keyed the radio, throat tight. "We've got them, alive but fading." Static answered. Then Kane's voice, unflinching, "Hold position. I'll cover extraction." Even as she spoke, another volley of gunfire erupted from the ridge. She pivoted, sighted, and cut the shooter down before his burst could reach the valley floor. Her shoulder screamed with pain, blood slicking her arm, but she pressed forward, seizing another perch. From her vantage, she could see everything now. The basin, Echo squad clustered around there, fallen, the drone circling erratically as if its controller no longer knew where to aim. The machine's beam flitted uselessly across stone, unable to decide which target mattered most. She drew a bead on the drone itself, exhaled, and squeezed. The suppressed crack of her rifle was followed by a sudden spark. The machine lurched, spiraled once, then crashed into the rocks with a metallic shriek. Below, the men ducked instinctively, then stared as the wreckage smoldered. For the first time since entering the rift, the sky above them was clear. Vega let out a ragged laugh. She just swatted their eye out of the sky. Draven didn't laugh. He only nodded, jaw set. Then we move now. While we've got the window, they hoisted Silva and Takeda onto improvised stretchers fashioned from gear straps and ponchos. Hale kept pressure on wounds, barking orders to keep them alive. The squad moved with renewed urgency, each man feeling the weight of comrades clinging to life. From the ridge, Kane shadowed their movement, rifle barking at any threat that dared emerge. Her body screamed with exhaustion, her blood loss undeniable, but her mind cut through it with the discipline of someone who had built her entire existence on pushing beyond limits. As the squad began their climb out of the rift, she stayed one step ahead, clearing blind corners, silencing ambushes before they could form. To Echo Squad, she was no longer an outsider with a clipboard. She was the unseen hand dragging them back from the brink. By the time they reached the first plateau, the valley behind them had transformed. The labyrinth of death that had swallowed so many now lay eerily still, its watchtowers silenced, its drones shattered. For once, the rift had nothing left to say. Draven paused, breathing hard, glancing up at the ridge where Kane stood, silhouetted against the setting sun. She lowered her rifle slightly, eyes scanning the horizon, always searching for the next threat. He realized then that they owed their survival not to luck, not to strategy written on maps, but to one woman who had refused to accept the valley's verdict. And though questions screamed in his mind, who she truly was, where she had learned to fight like this, he knew none of those answers mattered right now. What mattered was that they were walking out with their brothers still breathing, and Anna Kane had made that possible. The climb out of the rift became a race against exhaustion. Every step forward felt like rebellion, as though the valley itself tried to pull them back. Echo Squad staggered beneath the weight of their wounded, yet none faltered. The silence left behind was fragile, a silence carved not by surrender but by destruction of the traps that had ruled this place. Anna Kane moved along the ridge parallel to them, her figure half-shadowed against jagged stone. She shifted with deliberate economy, checking every angle, her rifle snapping once. Twice, each shot a preemptive strike on figures that dared rise from hiding. The echoes of her weapon were soft compared to the earlier blasts, but they were enough to reassure the men below that someone still shielded them. Ethan Draven felt sweat sting his eyes as he dragged the makeshift stretcher with Vega. Silva's breath rattled faintly, Takeda's pulse throbbed weakly beneath Hale's desperate grip. They had minutes, perhaps, before the weight of injuries overcame them. Every second bought by Kane was a debt the team could never repay. The ridge grew steeper. Stone slid under boots, threatening to send them tumbling back down into the jaws of the valley. Kane scouted ahead, scanning the skyline for any sign of pursuit. She expected counterattacks. The enemy had lost their positions, but pride and desperation made men reckless. Sure enough, a sudden burst of fire erupted from the far slope. Bullets stitched across the dirt near Draven's boots. The squad ducked, shielding their wounded. Kane pivoted instantly, bracing against a boulder, returning fire in short surgical bursts. Two shapes collapsed, the third scrambled into shadow and vanished. Her shoulder screamed with every movement, blood soaking deeper into her sleeve. She tightened her jaw, forcing the pain back down where it belonged. There would be time for weakness later. Not now. The squad pushed upward again, inch by inch, lungs heaving. The air grew thinner, tinged with the acrid scent of burned powder and scorched rock. Kane's presence loomed above them, sometimes visible only as a silhouette, other times nothing more than the echo of her rifle. When they finally crested the outer rim, the world widened. The mountains stretched in endless ridges beneath a merciless sun, the fob far beyond the horizon. The rift lay behind them, hushed now, stripped of its menace. Yet escape was far from secure. They still needed airlift, and they still carried 2 lives on the brink. Draven keyed his long-range radio, voice tight. "Redhaven, this is Echo. Package secured. Immediate extraction required." For a long, sickening moment, there was nothing. Then static cleared, and a voice broke through. "Copy, Echo. Bird inbound. Hold for pickup." Relief cracked through the squad like water through dry earth. But relief was fragile until rotor blades stirred dust on this ridge. They were still prey. Kane found a vantage point and scanned the horizon. Her breathing had slowed, each inhale deliberate, controlled. She saw the shimmer of movement across distant rock, fighters regrouping, perhaps unwilling to let their quarry slip away so easily. She shifted position, set her rifle, and waited. The minutes stretched. The wounded groaned faintly. Hale whispered encouragements, voice steady despite the desperation in his eyes. Vega crouched low, scanning sectors, hands twitching against the trigger. Draven checked his men one by one, seeing the exhaustion, the grime, the hardened determination that had carried them this far. And then at last, the faint thrum of engines. A dark speck against the sky grew steadily larger, rotors flashing in the sun. The extraction bird. The squad exhaled as one, tension bleeding out only slightly. They began dragging the stretchers toward the designated landing zone, a flat patch of stone barely wide enough for the aircraft. Kane shifted again, positioning herself where she could cover their movement. Gunfire cracked across the ridge before the helicopter arrived. Enemy fighters burst from concealment, their final attempt to erase Echo before rescue. Bullets shattered stone, sparks biting into the air. Kane rose into the storm. She advanced rather than retreating, rifle barking, her form unwavering despite the blood that streaked down her arm. She cut down one assailant, then another, moving with the calm fury of someone who had lived too long with inevitability. A round slammed into the rock beside her, fragments slicing across her cheek. She didn't flinch. She pivoted, fired twice, and the shooter collapsed into dust. Below, Draven shouted over the roar, "Get those birds down!" The helicopter swept in, rotor wash whipping dust into chaos. Crew chiefs leaned out, weapons ready, shouting signals. The squad heaved Silver and Takeda onto litters, pushing them toward waiting hands. Hale scrambled aboard with them, shouting vitals, his voice almost drowned by the storm of blades. Draven turned back just in time to see Kane stagger. For a heartbeat he thought she had tripped. Then he saw the spreading crimson across her side. She had taken another round, just below the ribs. Still, she didn't stop firing. Vega cursed and started toward her, but Draven grabbed his arm. "She's holding the line! Get on the bird!" Kane's last shots were methodical. She felled the final gunman with a clean double tap, then sank to one knee, rifle barrel lowering at last. She pressed a hand against her side, breath hissing through clenched teeth. The crew waved frantically for her to board. Dust howled around them, the downwash stinging eyes and skin. Kane rose, swaying, and moved toward the helicopter with the measured pace of someone refusing to show weakness even as blood soaked her uniform. Draven extended a hand. She ignored it, climbing aboard under her own power. Inside the bird, the squad collapsed into seats, strapping down as the helicopter lifted. Medics swarmed Silver and Takeda, tubes and bandages tangling as they fought to keep both alive. Hale barked updates, his voice raw with urgency. Kane sat apart, one hand still pressed against her wound, gaze fixed out the open door. The rift shrank beneath them, a scar in the earth already swallowing its dead. She said nothing. Draven sat across from her, searching her face. The woman who had arrived with nothing but a clipboard was now covered in blood and dust, her rifle resting across her knees. He wanted answers, needed them. "What are you really?" he asked, his voice low. Kane turned her head slowly, eyes unreadable. Not what you expected. It wasn't an answer, but it was all she would give. The helicopter thundered across the mountains, carrying them back toward Redhaven. The squad sat in silence, each man lost in the magnitude of what had just unfolded. They had been moments from annihilation. Now they were alive, carrying their wounded home. By the time they landed, night was edging across the horizon. Medics rushed Silver and Takeda away. The rest of the squad stumbled onto the tarmac, exhaustion etched into every line of their bodies. Kane disembarked last. She moved with deliberate steadiness, as though daring gravity to claim her. Blood streaked her uniform, but she brushed off attempts to lead her toward the medical bay. Instead, she disappeared into the shadows of the base. The next morning, her quarters were empty, her belongings gone. Paperwork filed, transfer orders processed, but no one had seen her leave. It was as if she had never existed at all. On the operations board in the tactical center, someone pinned a patch of black fabric. No unit insignia, no rank. Just a single line stitched in gray thread. Kane confirmed. Later, Hale found a folded scrap of paper tucked inside his medkit. The handwriting was precise, mechanical, unmistakably hers. Wind decides survival. Remember it. He stared at it for a long time, then tucked it back into his pack. Draven never spoke of her again in detail. When younger soldiers asked about the rift, he told them only this: don't underestimate the quiet ones. Sometimes they're the reason anyone comes home. And far from Redhaven, in places where no maps marked trails, whispers began to circulate. Stories of an observer who wasn't, a woman who walked into a kill zone alone and came back alive. To Echo Squad, she was no myth. She was the difference between ashes and survival, and to the Rift, once thought unconquerable, she was the proof that even the deepest trap could be broken by one person who refused to accept defeat. Fob Redhaven did not look the same when Echo Squad returned. The wire fences and guard towers stood in their usual places, the sandbags still, sagged in the heat, but an intangible shift had settled over the base. Men paused mid-step when they saw Draven's team disembark. Eyes widened, words caught in throats. It wasn't only the sight of stretchers being rushed toward the infirmary. It was the fact that Echo had come back at all. No one said it outright, but everyone knew. The rift had been a graveyard. Whole elements had vanished into that scar, and most of the base had already written Echo off as the next addition to that tally. Their return was a violation of expectation, and with it came a question that spread like wildfire. How? The squad moved through the stairs in silence. Dust clung to their faces, streaks of blood painted their uniforms, and exhaustion bent their spines. Yet something in the set of their jaws, in the way their eyes carried weight, told the others this was no ordinary survival. Draven felt the scrutiny but kept his focus on the men around him. Orrin Hale walked stiffly, medkit hanging from one shoulder, eyes still fixed on the memory of hands he had pressed against wounds. Cruz Vega stalked ahead, shoulders squared as though daring anyone to stop him. Noah Idris trailed behind, head lowered, thoughts buried under static that still rang in his ears. In the command tent, maps still covered the walls, red markers clustering around the rift. The room smelled of ink and stale coffee. Senior officers waited, faces carved into masks of professionalism, though unease glimmered beneath their eyes. Draven stood before them, dirt still streaked across his cheek, and gave the only explanation he could. We retrieved Silva and Takeda. We engaged hostile positions. Extraction successful. The words were clean, official, stripped of the chaos that had nearly consumed them. He omitted the detail that mattered most, that one woman had turned a slaughterhouse into an escape route. But the officers pressed. Your report notes enemy withdrawal. What caused it? Draven hesitated. The silence stretched until it felt like a weight pressing on the tent canvas. Finally, he said evenly, unidentified disruption. Enemy positions collapsed under pressure. Unidentified, one colonel repeated. Suspicion sharp. Draven met his gaze without blinking. That's correct. The exchange was recorded, logged, and filed into systems that would later redact half the words. On paper, the rift was declared neutralized through combined action. The truth that a logistics officer had dismantled an entrenched enemy network alone was buried under classification deeper than most files would ever reach. Outside, though, the story spread unchecked. Soldiers whispered over trays in the chow hall. Mechanics traded versions of the tale while tightening bolts on armored vehicles. A rumor rarely cared for accuracy. It only demanded momentum. Some said Kane had been a covert asset planted months earlier. Others insisted she was part of a shadow program no one dared name. A few dismissed it as exaggeration, claiming Echo Squad had fabricated details to mask their own failings. Yet the looks in Echo's eyes silenced most doubters. Vega bristled at the speculation, fists clenching when he overheard her name twisted into mockery. Idris avoided the talk altogether, retreating to the comms shack to bury himself in calibration work. Hale, when asked, simply shook his head. She saved them, was all he ever said. Draven kept his thoughts locked tight. He had seen her fire until her body nearly collapsed, had watched her bleed yet keep moving. No story told over cigarettes could capture the steadiness in her voice when the squad's world had been unraveling. In the days that followed, Silva and Takeda clung to life in the infirmary. Medics fought to keep their fragile pulses alive. Visitors trickled in, staring at bodies wrapped in tubes and bandages, whispering about the miracle of their return. None mentioned the cost, or the woman who had made it possible. One morning, when Hale reached for gauze in his kit, he found something he hadn't noticed before. At the bottom of the pocket lay a strip of cloth different from the patch already pinned in the tactical center. This one bore not her name, but a symbol stitched in faint silver, a jagged line cutting through a circle. No one recognized it. Hale turned it over in his hands, then tucked it back away. He didn't tell the others. Not yet. Meanwhile, orders came down from above. The rift was declared off-limits for future operations. The official reasoning cited strategic reallocation, but everyone at Redhaven understood the truth. Command had no explanation for what had happened there, and fear disguised itself best as policy. On the evening after the declaration, Draven walked alone to the edge of the perimeter. The sun bled into the horizon, painting the mountains in harsh crimson. He thought about Kane vanishing without a trace. No farewell, no explanation, only the echo of her presence in the valley and the silence she left behind at the base. He wondered if she had chosen to disappear, or if someone higher had pulled her back into the shadows she clearly belonged to. Perhaps both. Behind him, footsteps crunched. Vega approached, posture restless. "Chief, you think we'll ever see her again?" Draven didn't turn. That's not how people like her work. Vega spat into the dirt, frustration raw. "She walked into hell for us, and now she's just gone?" Draven's jaw tightened. Sometimes that's the only way it can be. The two men stood in silence, watching the desert swallow the last of the light. Inside the tactical center, the black patch still hung on the board. Soldiers came and went, glancing at it without speaking. It wasn't official, it wasn't sanctioned, but it was there, a quiet rebellion against the silence written into their files. And in that silence, something larger stirred. Because the rift was no longer a place whispered about with dread. Now it was a reminder that even the deepest trap could be broken. Not by artillery, not by overwhelming numbers, but by one person who refused to accept the inevitable. For Echo Squad, survival was no longer the end of the story. It was the beginning of a legend that headquarters would try to erase, but soldiers would carry forward anyway. And somewhere beyond Red Haven, far from maps and manifests, Anna Kane walked unseen, leaving behind fragments, patches, notes, symbols that ensured those who had fought beside her would never forget. The rift was silent again, but not the silence of defeat. It was the quiet that followed when myths were born. Dawn rolled over Red Haven with the color of hammered brass. Generators throbbed at a steady tempo, the kind of mechanical heartbeat you only notice after war has made you listen to everything. Echo Squad lined up in the dust, not for ceremony, but because standing shoulder to shoulder felt steadier than sitting alone with thoughts that kept circling back to the rift. Ethan Draven called them to attention, and then, immediately, at ease. He didn't do speeches. He'd learned a long time ago that the right words rarely arrived when you wanted them. Still, the men were waiting for something. Confirmation, direction, a new shape to put around what they'd lived through. He cleared his throat. "We're not going back," he said. "Command has closed the rift. Our job now is to make sure it never happens somewhere else." Cruz Vega's jaw flexed. He didn't ask the obvious question. None of them did. Asking would make the answer smaller than it deserved to be. Behind the line, Oren Hale set down his medpack. The corners were frayed and scuffed, torn by rock, stained by everything a medic never mentions. He slid the zipper halfway and touched the folded scrap of paper tucked. Inside, the one written in precise block letters, "Wind decides survival." He had read it so many times the words had weight. By mid-morning, the base moved like it always did. Fuel trucks rumbling, rotors testing, laundry flapping on lines as if any of this could be ordinary. But under that rhythm, murmurs flowed. People looked at Echo differently now, not with celebration, with a quiet recalibration. The story had outrun the report. In the infirmary, Silver blinked awake to a wash of antiseptic light. The ceiling fan turned with lazy insistence. He registered sound before pain, the low hum of machines, Hale's voice talking to a nurse, Draven. At the foot of the bed with shoulders squared in a way that meant he had slept only in fragments. Silver's lips parted. No words came at first. "Then did she make it?" Draven nodded once. "She did." Takeda surfaced from sleep in the next bed, eyes clouded with morphine and gratitude he could not shape into a sentence. Hale's hand found his shoulder. "Don't burn energy on the past," he said. "Your work is forward." Outside, the sky was white-hot and merciless. Noah Idris pulled the tarps off the comms array and set up an experiment he'd designed on a napkin during the sleepless night. He clipped narrow strips of tape to a wire stretched over a topographic sand table, then flicked on 2 industrial fans at opposite corners. The tape fluttered, almost invisible, tracing currents across miniature ridges. He adjusted the angles, then scattered a pinch of chalk dust. Eddies formed along the molded ravine. Pathways of lift and sink revealed themselves in ghostly arcs. Vega wandered in, drawn by the eyesore of bright fans in a room that preferred quiet. "What is this?" Idris watched the chalk swirl settle into patterns, a way to see something we talk about but never look at. She asked one question the morning we left: how the air moves. We've treated terrain as lines and numbers. I think we need to treat it as breath. Vega stared at the spiral of dust over the tiny basin. In the model, air pooled where a man would stall. On the ridges, currents raced like invisible rivers. "Run it by the team," he said, voice softer than usual. "If we teach this, we don't just aim better, we survive smarter." By noon, Draven had requisitioned an empty workshop and turned it into a classroom with nothing more than a battered projector and the sand table Idris kept fussing over. He drew a crude circle on a whiteboard and cut through it with a jagged line. "Forget the rift," he began. "This is every kill bowl you'll ever see. It looks like ground. It behaves like a trap. The difference between those two is what moves through it." He nodded to Idris. Chalk floated again, drifting until it pooled in the same treacherous low points, climbing in slender columns where the fans created lift. "This is why you thought you were hidden when you weren't. This is why their shots arrived before your minds did. Sound and scent travel with the air, and so do assumptions." He didn't say Kane's name. He didn't have to. The symbol on the board, a broken line through a circle, echoed the small piece of cloth Hale had found in his kit. No unit patch, no motto, just a sign that meant "read the unseen." They ran drills until sweat soaked through shirts, and the sand table looked like a battlefield in miniature. Recruits mapped alternate approaches, not by drawing new arrows, but by moving the fans, by shaping the air first and the footsteps after. It felt odd at first, like learning to listen with skin instead of ears. Then it felt necessary. Late afternoon slid in, so bright the edges of things went silver. That was when the convoy arrived at Redhaven without warning. 3 vehicles coated in powder, carrying a half-dozen officers with the kind of posture that suggested their opinions were already packed for delivery. One of them wore a ring of polished brass on a gloved hand. The emblem winked when he shifted. Major Leland Shaw introduced himself with the cadence of a man used to making rooms quieter. "We're here for a fact-finding debrief," he said, each syllable smooth as if sanded. "There are irregularities in your after-action summary. Irregularities." Draven held Shaw's gaze. "We're clean." Shaw smiled without warmth. "We'll decide that together." They took over a tent in the administrative row and set up microphones and legal pads, the tools of people who win wars by redacting them. Draven sat opposite, Vega to his left, Idris to his right. Hale remained at the infirmary. His testimony could wait. The questioning began where such things always begin. Irrelevancies that circle the true subject like wolves testing a perimeter. Who authorized the observer? Who had custody of the drone footage? Who signed munitions out of storage only after a steady hour of circling did Shaw lean forward? "Lieutenant Kane," he said, as if testing the taste of the name. "Role? Draven let the beat stretch. Observer. Capacity? Assessment. Shaw steepled his fingers. Mr. Draven, we both know those words mean nothing when a valley empties of hostiles in under an hour. Vega's chair creaked. Idris kept his eyes on the table. Shaw tapped the brass ring against the wood. Where is she now? We're not her handlers, Draven said. You know where she went. We know she isn't here. Shaw smiled again, not kindly. Your unidentified disruption reads like a fairy tale. Someone up there dismantled a hallway of guns. I don't care if it's a saint or a sin. I need a name. Draven leaned back. The canvas roof snapped softly in the wind. He thought of a woman walking into a place where even bravado dies. He thought of a patch pinned to a board because medals weren't fit for certain kinds of work. He thought of the note in Hale's kit, short, unromantic, true. He said, "The only name that matters is the one on the men who came home." Shaw's jaw set. The meeting adjourned with phrases like non-compliance and administrative action floating in the air like gnats. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. Power rarely announces itself, it assumes. The base absorbed the argument like desert takes a boot print. It held the shape for a day, then wind softened it. Shaw and his men left the next morning with boxes of transcripts and a copy of a report that still said nothing. Training didn't pause. On the range, Draven had recruits run a new course designed by Vega and Idris. Instead of fixed lanes, a bank of fans and heaters, scrounged from maintenance and persuaded into service, created shifting currents. Smoke pellets traced invisible paths. Shooters had to watch the air before sighting their targets. Some failed spectacularly at first. Others, mostly the ones who didn't talk much, adapted quickly. You could see the lesson take root. Terrain isn't lines on a map, it's a living thing with a pulse. In the hangar that had become a classroom, a fresh stencil appeared on the wall where no one admitted to putting it. A circle, cut by a serrated slash. Someone had spray-painted it small, low, almost where only a person tying their boot would notice. Hale saw it first, smiled once, and kept walking. Silver's color improved day by day. Takeda began to crack dry jokes out of habit and relief. Nurses shooed away half the visitors pretending to check IV lines just to be near the two men who had forced the base to redefine the word impossible. On the third morning after the convoy departed, Silver asked for paper. He spent an hour sketching the view from the rift's floor, not the rocks or the sky, but the angles, where he could not make out his enemy because the wind carried sound in the wrong direction. When he finished, he added one small note at the bottom: never trust a quiet valley. In the evening, as shadows stretched long and thin, a courier drone nosed in from the west and dropped a pouch at the command post. Inside were copies of 2 intelligence intercepts and a short memo stamped with a watermark nobody at Redhaven recognized. The intercepts were translations of enemy chatter recorded after the rift went silent. The voices argued, not about tactics, but about an apparition they called the woman on the ridge. There was fear where arrogance had lived before. The memo had no letterhead. It contained a single instruction: implement locally as doctrine if effective. No signature, no credits. Draven read it twice, then folded it into his pocket. The lack of ownership felt deliberate. The lesson wasn't proprietary. It was to be carried and adapted, not branded. At last light, Draven walked the perimeter. The heat had thinned, the air taking on an earthy coolness that always felt like reprieve. He stopped near the section of fence that looked toward the mountains. The rift lay beyond the horizon, just out of sight, which was fitting. Some places you don't stare at directly. You let them exist at the edge of vision and influence everything anyway. He took the small cloth Hale had shown him, the symbol stitched in faint silver, and tied it inside the pocket of his vest where no one would see, not as a talisman, as a reminder. You don't wait for heroes. You learn what they knew, and you teach it until it doesn't look like heroism anymore, just competence. Idris found him there, hands in his pockets. "The model's working," he said. "The newer guys catch on faster than they admit." Draven nodded. "Good, make it boring." Idris grinned. "The day survival becomes boring is a good day." A commotion near the motor pool pulled them back. Shaw's convoy had returned. This time, the officer didn't head for the admin tents. He went straight to the infirmary. Draven arrived in time to see Shaw standing over Silver's bed, asking questions with the poise of someone who believed empathy and pressure were the same tool at different settings. Silver looked tired but unbroken. "Sir, I was unconscious for parts of it." Shaw softened his tone. "What do you remember?" Silver stared at the ceiling, then at Shaw. Wind in the wrong direction, footsteps where no path was marked, shots that made no echo, and a person who didn't make introductions. Shaw's ring tapped the bed rail once. He turned to leave and found Draven blocking the doorway. The exchange that followed was civil and firm, and ended with Shaw telling Draven that non-cooperation had costs. "Everything worth something does," Draven said. When the convoy left for the last time, there was a different weight on the base. Not dread, not quite relief. The awareness that no official document would ever hold the truth. And that this was perhaps as it should be. 2 days later, Redhaven held a short formation by the tactical board. Someone had framed the black patch instead of pinning it. It looked out of place next to laminated maps and printed orders, handmade against mass-produced. Draven said nothing about it. He only nodded to Hale, who nodded back. "Here's what we keep," Draven told the assembled men. "Not names, not stories we can't verify. We keep methods. We keep each other. We keep the idea that there is always one more way through than the terrain suggests." He pointed at the training ground behind them, where the fans were still turning. "And we keep the air moving." After dismissal, Vega trailed him to the edge of the lot. "You think she'll hear any of this?" "She didn't do it to be heard," Draven said. Vega squinted into the late sun. "Then why leave signs? Patch, note, that symbol that keeps showing up?" Draven thought about the chalk dust rising over small ridges, about a circle cut through by a crooked line. So we'd have something to teach without having to say her name. The base fell into a new normal that wasn't normal at all. Patrols went out and came back. Letters were written and sometimes sent. The training yard stayed crowded at odd hours. Teams from other units started showing up, wordlessly watching the fans and the chalk, and then borrowing both. A mechanic from a neighboring fob arrived with a homemade smoke machine built from a scavenged fuel pump. The plume it made traced airflow so clearly even the doubters stopped scoffing. One evening, Hale opened his med pack again and found something he swore hadn't been there the day before. A small metal tag, dull and unremarkable, no name, only the serrated slash through a circle, etched shallowly. He held it under the buzzing light, then slipped it into the inside pocket next to the note. He didn't tell anyone. Some objects aren't for discussion. They're for remembering. On the 7th day after the rift, a sandstorm tore across Redhaven with all the subtlety of a freight train. Tents thrashed, flags snapped, visibility went to zero. The base shut down to bare function and waited. When the wind finally eased, the sky cleared into a hard blue that felt like a reset. Draven walked past the hangar and saw the stencil near the floor had collected a fine drift of sand along the bottom edge. It made the slash look like it was cutting through something tangible. He crouched, brushed the sand away, and noticed a faint set of letters sprayed. So lightly you had to be almost eye level to catch them. Confirmed. He didn't call anyone over. He stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and kept moving. By then, the story had already traveled faster than any convoy. Units on the other side of the province were training with improvised wind tunnels. An instructor at a remote range had started opening briefings by asking, "Where will the air betray you today?" No one used a name. They used a question. It worked better. Redhaven slept that night under a sky so clear it looked polished. Draven lay on his cot and let the generator's hum pull his thoughts into a shallower place. He saw the rift not as a wound anymore, but as a lesson stamped into geography. He saw a woman walking into noise and making it quiet by force of precision. He saw his men standing straighter not because someone saved them, but because they now knew how to save themselves. Just before sleep took him, he decided something that felt as practical as it did personal. If anyone ever asked for a doctrine, he would give them a short one. Read the air, move the angles, don't announce yourself. Leave only what others can use. In the morning, the fans were already turning when the sun broke. Smoke curled, chalk rose and settled, and the new recruits watched currents with the hungry concentration of people who had learned respect the hard way. Hale walked by, felt the small tag press against his ribs through the fabric, and touched it briefly as if to confirm it still existed. Idris adjusted a dial and grinned when a thread of smoke arced exactly where he expected it to. Vega barked at a private to drop his shoulders and feel the wind on the back of his neck. Draven stepped into the doorway and took it in, the ordinary miracle of men, teaching each other something they should have been taught all along. Past the fence line, the mountains wore the morning like armor. Somewhere beyond them, in a place without forms or protocol, Kane kept moving. Redhaven didn't know where. Redhaven didn't need to. The work, after all, was here. Weeks passed, but the rift refused to fade from conversation. It no longer belonged only to the men who had walked its floor. It had grown into something larger, carried in fragments of sentences, in chalk marks on training boards, in the way recruits lowered their voices when they spoke of unseen watchers on ridges. Echo Squad returned to routine missions, convoys, patrols, overwatch duties, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. They moved differently now. Draven noticed it first, the way his men raid terrain not just with maps but with their bodies, pausing when the wind shifted, adjusting formation instinctively. They carried the lesson as muscle memory, not as theory. Hale worked late in the infirmary, but sometimes he caught himself tracing the stitched line on the silvered patch in his pocket. It wasn't reverence. It was a reminder that saving lives demanded more than medical skill. It required anticipation, the courage to act before orders arrived. Idris continued refining his airflow models, turning improvised fans and chalk into a curriculum that spread beyond Redhaven. Units arriving from other sectors came to watch, pretending curiosity but leaving with sketches and borrowed notes. He never claimed credit. He only smiled and said, "Pay attention to what doesn't make noise." Vega, once the loudest skeptic, grew sharper in silence. He still barked when discipline slipped, but his edges had changed. When younger soldiers muttered doubts about impossible odds, he cut them off with 4 words, "So did the rift." It ended most arguments. And Draven, he carried the burden of knowing more than he could ever admit. He wrote official logs with deliberate blandness, reports scrubbed clean of the truth. Yet every night he walked the perimeter, eyes scanning the ridges, half expecting to glimpse a lone figure who never announced her presence. The higher command tried to smother the story. Files were locked, testimony redacted, missions reassigned. But stories don't live in archives, they live in men who can't forget. The tale of an observer who wasn't spread farther each week, carried in whispers, reshaped in retellings. Stripped of details until only the core remained, someone walked into death's mouth and made it blink. One evening, Silver and Takeda limped into the yard, scars still fresh but spirits unbroken. The base gathered in quiet respect. No speeches were given, none were needed. Their survival was speech enough. On the wall behind them, the framed black patch hung like a secret no one bothered to hide. The grey letters didn't spell rank or unit, just a confirmation that some truths matter even when they can't be written. Later that night, as the desert cooled, Draven sat outside the barracks. The stars burned fierce overhead, sharper here than anywhere else. He remembered Kane's voice over the headset, calm, absolute, refusing panic. He remembered the way she climbed into the bird under her own strength, refusing a hand, blood soaking her side but posture unbroken. He knew they would never see her again. People like her didn't linger. They appeared, shifted the balance, then vanished into the silence they came from. But absence wasn't the same as loss. Her presence lived on in the drills running on the range, in the chalk dust swirling across sand tables, in the way Echo squads straightened at the mention of impossible missions. She had become less a person and more a principle. Proof that inevitability could be broken if someone dared to step forward. The rift itself lay quiet now, abandoned by enemies who once ruled it. Winds swept through its hollows, carrying nothing but dust. Yet every man at Red Haven knew that Hollow no longer belonged to them or their foes. It belonged to the memory of a woman who rewrote its story. And in some unnamed place beyond maps, perhaps she kept moving, leaving small tokens for those who knew how to notice. A scrap of cloth, a carved symbol, a note that turned fear into instruction. Draven rose, brushed the sand from his palms and looked once more at the horizon. Then he turned back toward the barracks, where his men slept lighter than before but not broken, because survival had been given new shape and Echo Squad carried it forward. And the legend of Kane, silent, unrecorded, undeniable, walked with them into every fight that followed. When the dust of the rift finally settled, Echo Squad carried more than scars and memories. They carried a lesson stitched into silence. Sometimes the difference between ruin and survival is one person who refuses to bow. Kane never gave speeches, never asked for recognition, and in the end she disappeared the way she lived, without fanfare. But every soldier who walked out of that valley knew the truth. Her name won't appear in official records. Her face won't decorate medals or walls. Yet her shadow lingers in the drills new recruits now run, in the chalk that floats over sand, tables in the quiet confidence of men who've seen impossible odds turned upside down. And maybe that's the point. Heroes who walk away unseen don't vanish. They live on in the choices of those they saved. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments. Do you believe there are people around us, hidden in plain sight, carrying the strength to change everything when the moment comes? Hit like, subscribe to VeteranBiker, and share this with someone who knows that the most dangerous force in the room might be the one no one expected.